Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into single men dating. So this comes from an article that I posted in last week's show notes, and the title of the article is The Rise of Lonely Single Men. And so we're going to talk about kind of why there are more single men now than there were before and what's the cause of that, because I think it's linked directly to mental health. And it's also going to lead very nicely into next week's topic, which is suicidality. And so as most of you or many of you are probably aware, September is Suicide Awareness Month, and so that begins today. This is an extremely important topic, and for the rest of the month of September, that is what our focus will be on, is suicide. And so every episode this month will have the suicide hotline posted in our show notes, and it can't be talked about enough. You can never overtalk suicide.
Yeah, I agree. And pointed out it's been a year since we did talk about this last September. So it's time to hit it again.
Yeah. And so for our longtime listeners, maybe you'll hear some of the same stuff, but I don't think you can hear it too often. So it'll be a good month, and hopefully we can just bring some more awareness and help somebody. I know we'll reference a lot. Our most popular episode is Overcoming Suicidal Ideation, and it's a listener story that is incredibly powerful. And if you haven't listened to it, I highly encourage you to go back, because we talk about, this is a good friend of mine who overcame suicidal ideation around this time last year, and he's really open and he's really vulnerable about it. He goes in depth about his process, and we break it down, and it's just an incredible episode. So I highly recommend going back to September of last year and giving that a listen if you haven't already. So let's get into today's topic, which is the rise of lonely single men. So this stems from the premise that dating opportunities are diminishing for heterosexual men. And this article gives a few reasons why. And one of the big ones that they say is dating apps. So, and the way that this article phrases it, it's because dating apps are hugely popular and they're a big driver of new romantic connections. So, and it says the only problem is that upwards of 62 of the users are men, and many women are overwhelmed with how many opportunities they have, and the competition in online dating is fierce. So one of the things that I thought when it came to online dating, I think that this stems largely from a pretty significant problem that our culture has today, and that's the inability to communicate in person, which largely stems from social media.
I sure agree with that. I think we're raising a couple of generations now of young people who don't know how to communicate face to face. So I think you're probably right. But it's almost 2-to-1 men using these apps.
Oh, okay.
Compared to women, 62% compared to be about 38%. It's almost 2-to-1.
Oh, okay.
And so if you look at age ranges, so the age range 18 to 29, almost half of that group has used at some point some sort of dating app. And then as you get older, it starts to decrease. 30 to 49, about 38% have used a dating app, although that's still quite high.
Yeah.
And then 50 plus, it's down to 16%. I've been surprised at how many older clients I have who are using it. And I think that the reason is there aren't that many other options.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of people have moved away, say, from religion. I mean, that's a growing trend in our country as well. And so you used to find people, say, in your religious group or a club or at work. A lot of people are working at home now. And that's probably something that will continue, a fair amount of people working at home. So you don't have the contact in the workplace that would typically let you meet people. I think that's probably in the past that the work is one of the places where you meet people the easiest. And
yeah.
start dating. So, that has decreased as well. A lot of people don't like the bar scene. I think often, in the past, that's you go to a bar, you meet someone, you start chatting. A lot of people don't like that. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's probably a little bit more awareness around alcohol use. And so
Yeah.
it makes sense to me that the dating apps are successful or they're used a lot. And here's an interesting thing I found in all those categories, 20% of those people say they have found someone, they've married someone that
Hmm.
they've actually met on the online platform. Now,
Interesting.
the LGBTQ people are almost twice as likely as straight people to use
Okay.
app. And I was trying to figure out why the statistics where I found this did, of course, they don't have any idea really. You can make a guess as to why. I think that it's easier to find someone of interests and
Yeah.
sexual orientation. And so I think it's easier that way. And that kind of makes sense to me
Right.
that's what they're doing. Although the same thing could be said for heterosexual people using dating apps. It's easier, I think, to find people who have the same ideas as you. But so if you go back to, 60% of the users are men, about 38% are women. What that means is that women have a lot of choice
Yeah.
and men don't. And so
Mm-hmm.
men are waiting, for someone to respond to them. In this same survey that was done by the Pew Institute, men are much more likely to say that they didn't get enough messages than women. So
Hmm.
women are kind of being inundated with these messages, and
Yeah.
sometimes some women report that they're inappropriate messages. That happens
Oh, okay.
frequently, which is not good. But then the men aren't getting the response, because I've never been on a dating site. I don't know if you have at all. So
No.
I've had people explain it to me. I think a popular one, you always think of the swipe left or the swipe right, which I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know which way is which. I think one way is yes, I'm interested in you, and the other is not. But there's a woman, she's an anthropologist. Her name is Helen Fisher. And Match.com is, I don't know if it's the most popular one. It's certainly an old one, right?
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
And so they have a companion site called chemistry.com. And so the chemistry.com people hired this anthropologist, Helen Fisher, because her interest is how we mate. How do we choose mates?
Mm-hmm.
And when you listen to her, so she did whatever she does to develop this site. And I know they charge a premium for chemistry.com. I don't know that their success statistics are any different than any other. I haven't seen that. But when she talks about the dating apps, she really likes them. She
Okay.
thinks it's a good thing. And here's the reason why. Like if you walk into a room and say you haven't seen anyone,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you haven't met this person, and so you see them. What's the first thing that you're attracted by, or what's the first thing that hits you?
Their looks.
It's how they look. It's the only thing
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
have.
Mm-hmm.
And so she thinks it really saves a lot of time because you're just doing that very, very quickly. And
Okay.
so you're cutting out people who you wouldn't be interested in because you don't have that initial attraction. So I thought that was an interesting take on the apps. She actually thinks they're great. Maybe she was just saying that because they probably just paid her a lot of money to develop chemistry.com.
Yeah.
And so she had to say something positive about the app. But I think, the initial attraction is always going to be how a person looks.
And I think that it's also important, and we're talking about that physical attraction does matter in terms
Yeah.
of relationships. It should never be your primary focus. Like you should never marry someone for looks. We all know that, right? Just like you should never marry someone for money. Those are not good things.
Right.
But it's important to be physically attracted. There has to be chemistry between someone who you are dating. Like if you're going to date someone, there has to be chemistry there. And there has to be that physical attraction. Otherwise, the relationship is never going to develop into anything. And so
Right. And
physical,
that chemistry, that attraction is really based on things. I think it's initially looks, it's not entirely looks. So,
I
and
agree completely.
and so once you say you go on that first date, you may be attracted to the person, but I've seen plenty of people in my office who say, yeah, this guy or this woman was attractive, but we just didn't click. And so
Hmm.
that's the initial piece, but then there's certainly much more that's in
Yes.
that.
Yeah. I mean, Curtis and I met in college, and we both admitted there was no like love at first sight. I mean, we didn't look at each other and say, "Oh my goodness, that person is like the epitome of gorgeous," right?
Hmm.
That didn't happen for either of us. But
Right.
as we began talking, and we just never ran out of things to talk about. I mean, we must have sat for hours talking before we went on our first date. And so, as we got to know each other, like the physical attraction came,
Hmm.
but it wasn't the first thing for us. I mean, obviously, it matters and it's important for it to come, but I mean, it doesn't necessarily like it doesn't have to be love at first sight to be successful.
No, it doesn't. You're
Yeah.
right. You do have a sense. I believe people have a sense within 2 or 3 dates of whether or not
Hmm.
you should continue or not. I think the strong negatives are apparent pretty early on. I don't
Yeah.
know if the strong positive is necessarily present early on. I think that can grow, but I think the strong negative reaction is probably there early on.
Yeah, it's the red flags are usually easier
Mhm.
to see,
Yeah,
and that's a good thing because red flags should never be ignored.
yeah,
But going back to what you said about the dating app and, this phenomenon of you're kind of cutting out that love at first sight link, like you're really focusing on just people who share the same interests. And I like the way you described it. You walk into a room full of people you've never met before, all you have is their looks. And
right,
it's like, and not that we're advocating to judge a book by its cover, because we've all heard that adage, don't do that. But I mean, as human beings, like you said, that's all we have. And so it's very instinctive for us to make those snap judgments
right.
and right away on someone. And Curtis and I have both talked about our very first impression of each other, like that snap judgment that we made. And well, he's admitted to me it wasn't all that positive for me. Like, not that it was really bad, but I had a really odd sense of style in college. And that was his first impression of me. But he's like, you were a diamond in the rough, is the way he describes it. He's like, I found the diamond in the rough. So,
Uh,
anyways, but I think that's also why too that the it's so high among the LGBTQ people is because not everyone is flamboyant, I guess. And not that and I don't mean to say flamboyant like it's a negative thing, but like people that aren't always necessarily trying to like exude their sexuality, right? I
right,
mean, when you meet someone, you're not asking, so what's your sexual orientation? Like,
right.
right? Like,
Don't ask that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like you just don't go there. And so for LGBTQ people, I mean, because I don't know what the statistics are, but they're definitely in the minority. Like it's much
Right.
more common to be heterosexual than homosexual. And so I think it's just easier to find people online because it's like, yeah, hey, you're interested in this gender.
Right. I think I'm pulling this way out of the air. I think it's about 10 to 12%. That's
Okay.
what I'm recalling. So yeah, it makes sense. But I think even for heterosexuals dating apps, I think it makes sense because dating, the opportunities have diminished. I
Hmm.
think it's easier. We've raised an online couple of
Yeah.
generations now. They're used to it. It makes sense. So I get it. But I think that going back to this article,
Hmm.
about so what's different now than say 30, 40 years ago. What has changed? And I talk to a lot of couples about this because I think one of the things that has changed is women's expectations
Yes.
in potential partners has changed. I think that's a good thing, but I also think that their expectations are higher, their
Hmm.
standards are higher, let's say that. And I think what's changed, a couple of things. One is that, 40 years ago, women weren't in the workforce as much.
Yes.
And so it was often that they wanted someone. I don't know if you needed someone, probably you could say that, needed someone, who could work and support the family and they'd have kids. And so your expectations were not as high. But now women are able to support themselves. They're out in the workplace. And so they don't need that from a man.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so that takes away some of that appeal. And it means that men have to step up their game
Mm-hmm.
to meet the new level of expectations, which, we're going to talk about in a minute. But I think that, 40 years ago, just the expectations were different. I think that's probably the main thing, is that economically women are not at the mercy of men as
Right.
much. I
Right.
think in some cases they still are, but not as much.
So looking back to like the 50s or 60s, yes, women worked, but once they got married, they stopped working.
They often
Like
stop. Yeah.
almost always. And so, it was the role of a woman once she got married to, stay home and take care of the house and raise kids. That
Mhm.
was her primary role. And a woman doesn't need a man to do any of that. I mean, she doesn't even really need a man to have kids anymore.
Right, right. That's true. And there are plenty of single women who are doing that and making that
Mhm.
choice. So,
Yep.
so, if they want to be partnered, then they really can be choosier.
Mhm.
And I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's a good thing ultimately, because I think men need a push in that direction of stepping up their game in a lot of different, we'll go over these different characteristics, but I think hopefully this is what's going to push them in that direction, is that they want, in a way, they're marketing themselves, right?
Mhm.
If you're online, then you've got to come across as a good catch. You've got to have
Yeah.
good marketing.
Yeah.
So,
And because that's even true for dating, is when you do start dating someone, you're putting your best foot forward.
right.
Like you're trying harder because you want this person to like you. And, so I guess, I mean, it's the same thing really. So I understand why online dating is so popular. And maybe the reason why I don't like it is because I went the traditional route. I guess one of the things that bugs me about dating apps is it only makes the problem worse that young people have, and when it comes to social interaction in person. Teens these days, they really struggle with that, or a lot of people have lost that ability to connect with someone in person because so much connecting happens online, and it's
Right.
like they become face to face with someone and they don't know how to talk anymore. Like they don't know how to interact if there's not a screen between them. And I feel like dating apps make that worse, and that bugs me.
Well, I don't, doesn't make it worse. I think it can be a filter too. And here's how.
Okay.
So I just saw a woman in my office yesterday, and recently divorced. And I mean, getting ready to go out in the dating world again. And one of the things that she's found is that a lot of these men, they just want to interact over the computer.
Mm,
And so, and she wants to get out there and meet them and date, right? Which
yeah.
is the only way you're going to be able to make a choice. And so I
Mhm.
think even with older men, they may not feel comfortable in those communication skills. So I
Okay.
don't know if I mean, I agree with you about the younger generation, the generation who grew up, texting and
Mhm.
not really being able to do the face to face. I think it's a real problem. But eventually, in order to make a connection, you're going to have to meet and
Yeah.
start dating in the real world. And so with this woman I was seeing yesterday, we decided that's actually a pretty good filter, because if the guy isn't willing to meet and go out on a date, then you can just say,
Mhm.
okay, move on,
Yeah.
because that's a pretty good indicator that either he's afraid or nervous or something, or doesn't know how to communicate well.
Mhm.
So yeah, it might exacerbate the problem a little bit, but I think you're still going to meet and go out on dates. That's the only way you're going to make it work.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about is why this problem is so prevalent among heterosexual men. So, what is it about gay relationships that makes it easier for men? Or, I guess, is it still hard for gay men to find other gay men to be in a relationship with?
Is it hard? I mean, it's a very good question. As I was thinking about it, I think the first thing that came to mind is that the expectations are different.
Okay, that's what I figured too.
Yeah, and so I think that the expectations for the relationship, I think often, I don't know if this statement is going to be true or not. I think possibly heterosexual women are looking for a potential partner.
Okay,
And so the expectations are, they're going to be looking at it in a very different way.
okay,
Like, maybe, for instance, how will this man be as a father?
okay.
And
Yeah.
So what are the qualities that, he would use as a father, or, is he motivated to go out and get a job? So I think in the gay community, I think the expectations are different, and it's not, although now there are certainly many more gay men and lesbians who do get married.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you look 20 years ago, that wasn't the case because it wasn't
Right.
legal. So
Mm-hmm.
they were looking at it from a very different perspective, I think, than finding that potential marriage partner, because it wasn't in their radar.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may be changing now, but I think that's one of the big differences.
And one thought I had about it too is the fact that maybe because they're both men, they're maybe a little bit more forgiving of what women might perceive as shortcomings. Does
I
that make
think you're right. I think you're exactly
okay?
right. I think you're right
Yeah,
about
I mean, because if a man isn't very good at communicating, or if he's not as emotionally vulnerable,
that.
then
Right.
I mean, another man might not mind it so much. Maybe that works out great for him.
I've often pointed that out to gay couples and even to heterosexual couples. You put two men together and the communication is going to be very different.
Right.
Typically, I mean, often it's not, but it's a generalization we're making. But I think you're right. I think
Hmm.
that is also one way the expectation is different.
Okay. Yeah. So another thing that this article brought up that I thought is really important to talk about is what he refers to as a skills deficit. So
Hmm.
women these days are looking for, like we talked about earlier, they're looking for more than just someone to provide for them. They
Well,
can
because
do
they don't need that
it
anymore.
exactly. They can do it all on their own. They can go to a sperm bank, have a baby, have a career, get pregnant, raise a child. They can do all of this without the help of a man, which means they can be more choosy. And so they start looking for other qualities that are more important to them. And so one of the qualities that they said is men who are emotionally available, good communicators, and share similar values.
Right. So you're going to have to keep me in check here, because we could go on for probably another hour. I
Oh
could go
yeah.
on for another hour talking about these, what you called skill deficits, which I think is a good way to put it.
Mhm.
So I think I've said this on the podcast before that, I don't know, maybe 80% of the couples that I see come in, and in that first session, sometime they're going to say, we are not good communicators.
Mhm.
But often what it amounts to is, and again, generally, I'm making this generalization because it's often
Yes.
true, that the females feel like they aren't emotionally connected to their husbands.
Mhm.
And I think it's a problem in how we raise men in our culture, is we don't raise them to be emotionally intelligent.
Right.
That doesn't mean all men are not emotionally intelligent, because there's certainly men out there who are. But as a general rule, I think that, and I only see the couples who are struggling. I want to acknowledge
Right.
that.
Mhm.
But that's often what it's about, is that men have a harder time being emotionally available
Mhm.
and being able to make that intimate emotional connection.
Yeah.
And so that is a real deficit. And I think, as we talk about or think about, how do men change that? Where do
Mhm.
you get those skills? I mean, I am a therapist. It's what I do, but I certainly work with individual men who want to, increase those skills as well. I don't think therapy is the only answer, though. I don't want to
Right.
imply that, but it's one way for people to increase skills. But I think some of this for men is being able to talk about it and be aware of what are the expectations. And so, yes, listening, conversational skills, that being emotionally available, that's really important. But here are a couple of others that I think are important. And I pulled some of these from some articles, and others just, my work with couples. A sense of humor is really important.
A sense of what? Sorry.
Humor, being
Humor.
funny. Yeah, sense
Okay.
of
Okay.
humor.
Yeah. Yep.
And what the women say is they want someone who can make them laugh. And when you think about it, life gets tough sometimes, and laughing is really important for us.
Mhm.
The other thing that this also makes sense to me, it kind of makes me laugh because you said you had a unique style, I think you said, in college.
Yeah, I had my sense of dress wasn't exactly on par, or I guess it wasn't on point, you could say.
Okay. Well, for women, style is important as well. And what they call personal care. Now, they didn't say hygiene, but that
Yeah.
is what I thought. is
Yeah.
that some men, not all men, some men have some difficulty with style and hygiene, personal
Mm-hmm.
care, and they
Yeah.
need to pay more attention to that. Being kind. The next couple are really important. Having passion and initiative,
Okay.
not necessarily in the workplace, but it can be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think often women well, I think we all want, people who are interesting and who are invested in life and really active in life. And so that means having passion for something. And
Mm-hmm.
often it's work, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a hobby, like being passionate at skiing. You work to make a living and then you're just passionate about skiing or passionate about hiking.
Yeah.
The other thing is confidence. Now, I would add a word to confidence, and that would be being assertive.
Mm-hmm.
And assertive, I want to make sure everyone understands assertive is different than being aggressive.
Yes.
So I'm not talking about being aggressive, I'm talking about being assertive.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I'm working with a couple right now where the male is not assertive. And that usually comes from family of origin or history. But
Mm-hmm.
women want equality.
Mm-hmm.
That is certainly true. But they also want a husband who is somewhat assertive. That feels
Right.
good. I, and that I would say is almost universal in the couples that I've seen. I can't think of any, where they don't want them to be aggressive, but they certainly want them to be assertive. But if you link assertiveness with kindness
Yes.
and the ability to listen and communicate well and be emotionally available, I mean, you can see they all go together, right? The listening, being kind, being assertive, that's not a bad mix to have.
No. And so as you're saying all these words, I'm thinking of like, some maybe specific examples. And so when it comes to, communicating and listening, if men can just learn to, look like make eye contact with your speaking
Mhm.
when you're speaking, listen and validate without trying to fix the problem, that's going to go a long way in helping, I guess, spark that interest or, or ignite a spark. Like that's going to be huge. And when it comes to, initiative and being assertive, I know that this is something that a lot of women talk about is it frustrates them that they are constantly having to tell their husband what to do. They say,
Right.
"Hey, I need you to do
Yes.
this. I
Yes.
need
Yes.
you to do this." Where it's like, why can't you just see it and do it? Now, I want to
I hear that almost every day, Liz. those
yes.
those exact words.
Yes. Now, I want to be clear. I think that sometimes women take that too far. I think
Mhm.
that there are times where, women expect men to just jump in and do something and they have no idea. So I think there's a balance there. But men need to learn to recognize a problem before it's told to them and jump in.
Right. And the way a lot of people phrase it that I like is they want their husbands to be more present. And
Yeah.
what present, just being aware of what's going on around. This is especially true if there are children involved.
Yes.
Where's the kid? Is he, running out the front door? Does the diaper need to be changed? Things like that, as
Mhm.
opposed to waiting for someone to say, hey, go change the diaper. If the diaper's dirty, you pick up the kid and you go change the diaper.
Yeah.
And so you're being present and aware of what's going on. And so I think that we can't end this particular part of our segment without talking, at least I don't want to end it without talking about gaming,
Mhm.
video games, and pornography. And I know we've
Okay.
talked about that before, and I've mentioned the book by Philip Zimbardo called Man Disconnected, where he talks about this and gives a very good analysis that for young men who are gaming or using porn, in excess and in isolation is what he says. And you couple that with the book I mentioned a couple of weeks ago called Dopamine Nation,
Mhm.
that I think what's happening is a real problem is what we would call dopamine depletion. And so again, dopamine, as we've talked about a couple of times, is it's a little bit about the reward system, but it's more about motivation. It's about the anticipation of reward. And so I think one of the things that's happening is we're raising a couple of generation of men who are lacking motivation.
Yeah.
And that is one of the things that women want. They want someone who's motivated, who's
Mhm.
passionate, who is active, who is able to, let's say if they don't need to go to college, and but to be active in the world and be able to accomplish things. And I think there are a lot of young men who are lacking that motivation because they have that dopamine depletion because of the video gaming and the porn use. Additionally, I'll just make, because I don't want to harp too much on the porn use, but I think the other problem is it, which we've talked about in the past, is it gives men a really inaccurate view of what sexuality with a real life partner is. And I think that's a problem too.
Yes. Yes, it is. And so I want to reference an episode we did back in April 28th, called Pornography in Marriage. And we go into that more in depth about why it's a problem. And we really talk in depth about pornography in marriage. And I feel like we give it a fair shake as far as being unbiased about pornography or not inserting our morals into it, right?
Right. We don't need to go into it again, because I think it's in that episode, but I think it can be problematic, not just in marriage, but in dating, because, I think probably the I don't know the statistics on that, but I think most people who are dating are sexually active before they're married. And so it's one of the things that you need to, they're judging the other person on, does this work? Does it not work?
The only thing I want to add to that in closing is that media portrayal of sexual relationships is also inaccurate. Even if it's not pornographic, what you see in the movies is very, very often not correct.
Right. If we talk about the skills deficit, I think the end question ought to be, okay, well, what do men do? I don't know that I have an answer for that.
Yeah.
I think I've talked before on previous episodes about what I call the behavioral roadmap. So I think what men can do is make yourselves aware of what the expectations are, write down what the expectations are, and then behaviors that go along with those expectations, and create your own behavioral roadmap to become the man who, would be attractive to most women. It's all about behavior. If you think about this, everything we've talked about, it's all behavior.
Yeah.
And so for men, get in charge of your lives, figure out how you want to be, and then start behaving that way. I think that's the solution.
Yeah, I agree. And so before we wrap up, I do have to insert one more thing. So because I know gamers have kind of a negative connotation to them, and I get it, because a lot of people struggle with video games and doing it excessively where it becomes impulsive behavior bordering on addiction. Like I get that is a problem, but I also want to point out that it is possible to just be a video gamer and it's something you just enjoy. And and Curtis, and Curtis very much falls into that category. He's a gamer, but he's got a balance, right? I mean, he's got a really good balance. I mean, it's his hobby. He's passionate about it. He loves doing it, but he's got a full-time job, Okay. So
Curtis just walked up. Hi, Curtis.
We're laughing right now because as I'm saying this, my husband just walked into the camera with a video game and started pretending to play video game. Anyways, so he's got the balance. He's got the full-time job, but he's got a career. Like, one of the things that I appreciate most is that if I ask him to, he will always get off and help me or just spend time with me. I think that's really what it comes down to. And what, most women appreciate is, set that expectation of, hey, this is your thing. I get it. That's cool. But make me a priority, right?
Right. I don't want to come across too negative about that either.
Yeah, I get it.
And that book, Man Disconnected, is really a good explanation, but it's about in excess and isolation. Those two things are really bad. So the final thing I want to say, men, do something about it.
Yes.
Change your behavior.
Yeah.
Step up your game. That's all it's needed.
Yep. All right. Next week, we are going to talk about suicidality, and we're most specifically going to get into suicidality among men and women and kind of what's the driving factor for the genders and why men are more successful at suicide than women. And I don't mean successful in a good way.
Right.
So have a good week, everyone. We'll see y'all next week.
Goodbye.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.